The official historian Robert O'Neill described it as probably the greatest feat of the Australian Army during the Korean War. 28 days later, someone handed it back without a fight. I spent weeks going through AWM archives, the official history of the Korean campaign, and testimonies from 3 RAR veterans to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear is the story of a battle that Australian historians call extraordinary, and that almost nobody outside Australia has ever heard of. And what happened after it ended. Maryang San, Hill 317, near the Imjin River, approximately 38 degrees north, 126 degrees east. A steep elevation rising 200 meters above the valley in front of it, with ridges running east and west. In any other context, just another hill in the broken geography of the Korean peninsula. In October 1951, the most important point on the front. The importance of Maryang San was threefold. First, terrain dominance. While the Chinese controlled Hill 317, they dominated all the ground to the south. They had direct observation over Allied movements in the valley. They could observe, direct fire, and plan attacks with an information advantage that no alternative position compensated for. Second, the political moment. Armistice negotiations had been underway at Panmunjom for months. And in that specific war, a war where battles were fought as much at the negotiating table as in the field, every kilometre of terrain that UN forces controlled when the ceasefire came was a kilometre of advantage in the terms of the agreement. Maryang San was the last chance to push the line before the armistice froze positions permanently. A victory at Maryang San would push communist forces 2 to 3 kilometres further north. 2 to 3 kilometres that at the Panmunjom negotiations could be worth weeks of diplomacy. Third, the principle. The Chinese couldn't be allowed to maintain that position while peace was being negotiated. The image of ending the war with Hill 317 looking south from Chinese positions was unacceptable to UN commanders. Someone had to take it. General James Van Fleet of the US 8th Army designed Operation Commando, a 4-division offensive scheduled for the 3rd to 5th of October 1951. The objective was to push communist forces 10 kilometers further north of the 38th parallel before armistice negotiations permanently fixed the lines. Within that offensive, the 1st Commonwealth Division had its assignment. Cross the Imjin River, take a line of heights defended by the 19th Division of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. And on that line of heights was Maryang San. The mission of taking Maryang San was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment. 3 RA. The same battalion that had fought at Kapyong 6 months earlier, that had held what the Chinese threw at that valley and had received the American Presidential Unit citation. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett. Hassett looked at Hill 317 and made a tactical decision that would define the assault. Not a direct frontal attack toward the summit. A tactic that 3 RA had inherited from the lessons of the Second World War in New Guinea. Running the ridges. Advance along the ridge lines surrounding the hill, controlling the lateral heights before pressing toward the central point, using the terrain instead of fighting against it. 4 o'clock in the morning of the 5th of October, 1951. Dense fog over the hills of the Imjin River. And in that darkness, 3 RAR began to move. Not in a straight line toward the summit, not in the frontal attack any defender would have anticipated and prepared for. Along the ridges, Hassett's plan had something that no Chinese defender on Hill 317 had fully anticipated. A deception. A company attacked westward along a parallel ridge south of Maryang San. It took a Chinese position. It drew the local Chinese reserves toward it, making them believe that was the main attack. It wasn't. While the Chinese moved their reserves west to respond to A Company, the real assault was developing along the North Ridge. B Company took Feature Whiskey and established supporting fire positions. D Company passed through B Company and advanced toward the next Chinese positions. 4 small hills, Each one defended, each one taken in fighting that Australian reports describe as bitter. It wasn't clean. It wasn't fast. It was exactly the kind of combat that Korean terrain produced position by position, metre by metre, with Chinese fire arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. At 10 in the morning, the fog began to lift. The Australian advance was exposed. And here is the moment the reports capture with a precision that says a great deal about what the Chinese had calculated and what they hadn't. The communists hesitated. Briefly. Not long, but long enough. C Company had been marching along a route that circled the hill from Maryang San. While B and D companies fixed Chinese attention with their attacks on the North Ridge, C Company passed through both of them along the spine. 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th of October, 1951. C Company took the summit of Maryang San. The summit was Australian, but the Hinge, the connection point between Maryang San and the adjacent ridges, was still in Chinese hands. And the Hinge was the problem. Throughout the 6th of October, the Australians held the summit against intense Chinese fire and repeated attempts to infiltrate the position. Without the Hinge, the summit position was vulnerable from the flanks. The Chinese knew it, and they pressed. On the 7th of October, 3 RAR now assembled along the entire spine of Maryang San attacked the Hinge. What the AWM archives describe of that attack captures something that casualty numbers can't fully capture. A fierce action distinguished by numerous acts of great gallantry. Not one, not two, numerous. Men doing things the manual didn't specifically prescribe, but that the situation required with the urgency of someone who knows that if the position isn't taken now, it may never be taken. The Hinge fell. When the dust settled over Hill 317 on the 8th of October 1951, the numbers told a story that military historians still study. 20 Australians killed, between 89 and 104 wounded. The 2 Chinese battalions that had defended Maryang San lost 340 killed or wounded. 1 Australian battalion, 2 Chinese battalions, on terrain favouring the defender, with the Australians attacking, not because they had technological superiority, not because they had massive air support, but because Hassett had designed a plan that used deception, terrain, and inter-company coordination in a way that the Chinese defenders hadn't fully anticipated, and because the company and platoon commanders had responded to Hassett's directives with exactly the kind of tactical initiative that the Australian Army had spent decades building from its sections and platoons upward. Robert O'Neill, the official historian who spent years reviewing every document, every report, every testimony from the Australian-Korean campaign, arrived at a conclusion that no partial analysis could produce. Probably the greatest feat of the Australian Army during the Korean War. A classic battalion operation. The afternoon of the 7th of October began with something the Australian veterans at the Hinge would remember for decades. Chinese artillery bombardment. Constant, precise, designed for 2 simultaneous purposes. Destroy the Australian positions that had just taken the Hinge that same morning. And cut the resupply routes, prevent ammunition from getting in, prevent the wounded from getting out. The Australians held their positions under that bombardment for hours, without fresh ammunition arriving, with the wounded where they were because there was no way to evacuate them. And then, at nightfall, something happened that Lieutenant Colonel Hassett would describe later with the precision of a man who has been thinking about that moment for decades. Silence. Half an hour of silence after hours of constant bombardment. Any combat-experienced soldier knows what that silence means. Not the end of the attack. The beginning of something worse. When the silence ended, what came was what Hassett judged as the heaviest and most accurate artillery fire the Australians had faced in the entire Korean War. Not in that specific battle. In the entire war. And behind that fire, when the bombardment reached its peak, came the fresh Chinese battalion. The 3rd Battalion of the 571st Regiment. Men who hadn't fought in the previous days. who weren't exhausted from the Australian assault of the 5th, 6th and 7th of October, who arrived at the Hinge with full ammunition and orders to recover what 3 RAR had taken, against B Company of Australia, who had been fighting for days, who hadn't been able to resupply during the bombardment, who had wounded they couldn't evacuate. What followed during the next 18 hours is what the AWM archives describe with the economy of language that military documents use when the facts are sufficiently eloquent by themselves. A series of desperate and courageous Chinese counterattacks throughout the night. Not one, not two, a series. Wave after wave of the fresh Chinese battalion hitting the Australian positions at the Hinge. Each attack with the same objective: recover that connection point between Maryang San and the adjacent ridges that the Australians had taken that same morning, and each time the Chinese attacked, B Company forced them to withdraw, with heavy losses. Think about what that means physically. Men who had been fighting for days, who had assaulted Chinese positions on the 5th, 6th and 7th of October, who had taken the Hinge that same morning in an action the archives describe as fierce, who had spent hours under the heaviest artillery bombardment of the war, without fresh ammunition, unable to evacuate their wounded, and who for 18 hours responded to waves of a fresh Chinese battalion with enough consistency that each of those waves ended in Chinese withdrawal with heavy losses. The morning of the 8th of October, 1951 arrived over the Imjin Hills with something that none of the men at the Hinge had been able to fully calculate during the night. The Chinese had gone. Not simply withdrawn from the Hinge. Withdrawn from all of Maryang San, Hill 217 also evacuated. The Chinese had pulled back to the next line of hills 2 kilometers to the north, conceding defeat. If this story is pulling you in, now is the time to subscribe to the channel. Every week we publish documentaries about the Australian military stories that history books don't tell. One click, and you won't miss any of them. There's a detail in the defence of the Hinge that the official reports mention with the brevity of something nobody wanted to develop too much. The Australians almost ran out of ammunition. The brigade commander, Taylor, watching the reports coming from the Hinge during the Chinese assaults of the night, made a decision that the archives describe with an economy that doesn't fully capture what it meant. Fearing the Australians would be overwhelmed by the persistent Chinese attacks, he ordered a full concentration of divisional artillery in support of 3 RAR. All the divisional artillery. Not part of it. All of it. But even with that support, there were moments during the night of the 7th to the 8th of October when Australian ammunition at the Hinge came so close to the limit that the men defending the position resorted to the only thing that requires no ammunition: hand-to-hand combat. Kicking, strangling. The words the archives use to describe what happened in the most critical moments of that night say exactly how close the Hinge came to falling. Maryang San wasn't just a position. It was the anchor of the Australian sector of the 1st Commonwealth Division, and the 1st Commonwealth Division operated within a front that included the American 1st Cavalry Division and the 9th Republic of Korea Division. Operation Commando was a coordinated offensive of 4 divisions on a wide front. If Maryang San fell, if the Chinese recovered Hill 317 and returned to dominating the ground south of the Imjin, the flank of the entire operation was exposed. Not just the Australian sector. The flank of all of Operation Commando. And here is what the operation's numbers say about what was really at stake. Operation Commando ended on the 15th of October with 1 corps successfully capturing the Jamestown line. 4 Chinese armies destroyed in the process. 21,000 Chinese casualties against 4,000 from the UN. That victory wasn't possible with the flank compromised. Maryang San wasn't a hill 3 RAR had to take. It was the peace that made everything else possible. Major General James Castles commanded the 1st Commonwealth Division. He had seen the best units of the British Army operate. He had evaluated battalion operations in multiple theatres. When he evaluated what 3RAR had done at Maryang San, he said something that, in British military circles, wasn't said easily about any unit from any country. One of the finest battalion attacks in British military history. Not in Australian history. In British history. Lieutenant Peter Scott was the battalion's intelligence officer. His job was to be where information mattered most, and in that battle, information mattered most at the summit. He survived the bombardment. Decades later, he described it to the Australian War Memorial with the precision of someone who has thought about that moment more times than he can count. Sitting on top of 317 on the 7th of October, being bombarded to extinction is the day that stays in my mind. About the overall result, he said something that captures what 3RAR knew about what it had done. It was very, very successful, and I think we came out very, very well because we really shook the Chinese. Frank Hassett commanded 3RAR at Maryang San with the precision of a man who had studied the terrain before designing the plan. The A Company deception to draw Chinese reserves. The 3 companies coordinated along the ridges. C Company's circuitous route from Maryang San. None of that was improvisation. It was exactly the kind of planning that receives a distinguished service order, which is what Hassett received immediately after the battle. Major Jack Gerke commanded C Company, the one that took the summit at 5 in the afternoon on the 5th of October. He wrote a complete first-hand account of his company's actions that the AWM archives preserve as a historical document. Major Geoffrey Shelton commanded A Company, the one that executed the deception that drew Chinese reserves westward while the real assault advanced along the north. He already had a military cross when he arrived at Maryang San. Major H.W. Nichols commanded B Company, the one that took Feature Whiskey, provided supporting fire and then defended the Hinge for 18 hours against a fresh Chinese battalion. Major Basil Hardiman commanded D Company, the one that took the 4 hills in bitter fighting before C Company could advance toward the summit. He was wounded during the battle. And beneath those company commanders were the platoon lieutenants. Maury Pears, whose severely reduced platoon was the first to take both Hill 355 and Hill 317. Russ McWilliam. Arthur Pembroke, who led the successful attack on Position Sierra. Jim Hughes. Men in their 20s commanding platoons in one of the most intense battles the Australian Army had fought since the Second World War. Jimmy Burnett was from Queensland. Bren Gunner in the 7th Platoon. The AWM archives record him with a specificity that captures something tactical analyses can't. He fired from the hip during the assaults. Not from a prepared position, not from cover, from the hip, advancing, in the assaults that took the Chinese positions on the North Ridge. Lance Yeo was a corporal. He died from a shot to the head during the attack on Position Sierra. One of the 20 Australians killed in 6 days of fighting. His name is in the AWM records with the same bureaucratic precision as all the others: date, unit, circumstances. Without enough space to say what the men who were beside him when he fell knew about him, Arthur Stanley was the company sergeant major of C Company. While the Maryang San summit was under the heaviest bombardment of the war, Stanley was evacuating wounded and maintaining the flow of supplies. Under intense fire, without anyone being able to wonder when it was going to stop, because nobody knew when it was going to stop, Jim McFadzean was a signaller in C Company. He maintained communications throughout the battle. In a battle where communications were the difference between the coordination that won Maryang San and the chaos that would have lost it, McFadzean did his job with a consistency that the archives capture in a single sentence. Surprise, speed, and aggression won the day. On the 5th of November 1951, 28 days after 3RAR took Maryang San, the Chinese launched a renewed offensive. The British troops who had relieved the Australians couldn't hold it. Maryang San returned to Chinese hands. The archives don't fully capture what that moment meant for the 3RAR men who had fought for that hill, but the historical documents use a phrase that says it without needing more words. It was a terrible blow to the morale of those who had fought long and hard to capture it. It was never recovered. Hill 317, remained in Chinese hands until the armistice of July 1953. The hill that General Cassels had called the scene of one of the finest battalion attacks in British military history, that O'Neill had called the greatest feat of the Australian Army in Korea. That had cost 20 Australian lives and more than 100 wounded. In Chinese hands? For the rest of the war. And the Victoria Cross of Maryang San went to British soldier Bill Speakman of the King's Own Scottish Borderers for his actions on the 4th of November 1951 trying to hold what 3 Ra had taken, one day before the Chinese recovered it. Maryang San is one of the most paradoxical battles in Australian military history. Not because the Australians lost, but because they won with a brilliance that the best military analysts of the era described as extraordinary, and then watched what they had won handed over without anyone asking them. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War, not just in Australia, in every country that participated. It happened between the Second World War, the war that defined a generation, and Vietnam, the war that divided a society. And in the space between 2 wars that filled all the historical attention, Korea remained as a conflict that ended without a clear victory. And Maryang San, an extraordinary battalion battle within that forgotten war, whose result was handed over 28 days later, was buried within what was already buried. But within 3 Ra, Maryang San was never forgotten. On the 3rd of October each year, the RSL and Australian veterans organisations commemorate the battle. Not with the scale of Anzac Day, not with the public recognition that Gallipoli or Kokoda receive. With the precision of a unit that knows exactly what its predecessors did and doesn't need the rest of the world to validate it to know it. Bob Breen wrote a book dedicated exclusively to the battle. The Battle of Maryang San. 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, Korea, 2nd edition, because the 1st sold out. Within the regiment, Maryang San is the gold standard. The example cited when describing how a battalion attack on prepared enemy positions should be executed. Not Kapyong, not the more famous battles. Maryang San. Arthur Stanley, the company sergeant major who had evacuated wounded and maintained supplies under the heaviest bombardment of the war, described it decades later with the precision of someone who knows exactly what he lived through. One of the best planned operations, expertly commanded, fought with outstanding gallantry by all who participated in some of the worst terrain in the world, with victory at the end. With victory at the end, Stanley knew the hill was lost 28 days later, and still said with victory at the end. Because the victory that mattered wasn't the hill. It was what 3 RAR had demonstrated it could do. There is a detail in the Maryang San archives that tactical analyses don't mention frequently. 5 of the 21 Australians killed at Maryang San had already survived the Battle of Kapyong 6 months earlier. Kapyong. The battle where 3 RAR had held what the Chinese threw at that valley and had received the American Presidential Unit citation. 5 men who had survived Kapyong, who had gone back to the front, who had fought at Maryang San, and who hadn't come back from the second. It's not a large number statistically, but it says something about what it means to serve in a battalion that fights the way 3 Ra fought. That goes where it's sent. That takes the positions it's assigned. That holds what it has to hold. And that sometimes loses men who had already survived what nobody should have to survive. Today, Maryang San is in North Korea. There is no Australian memorial on Hill 317. There can't be. There are only archives, and books, and a commemoration on the 3rd of October each year that most Australians don't know takes place. And within 3 RAR, the knowledge of what their predecessors did there, which was probably the greatest feat of the Australian Army during the Korean War, and lasted 28 days. There's something about this story that the tactical analyses don't capture. Not the casualty ratio, not the intercompany coordination, not the ridge-running tactic inherited from New Guinea. It's this. B, company of 3 RAR spent 18 hours at the Hinge against a fresh Chinese battalion, without enough ammunition, resorting to kicking and strangling when the ammunition ran out. And they held. And 28 days later, someone handed over what those men had won. Without asking them, probably the greatest feat of the Australian Army during the Korean War. It lasted 28 days. And the men who executed it remember it as a victory. Because for them, it was. If this channel is telling you stories you haven't heard before, subscribe now. We're a small channel building something big. Every subscriber matters. And the next documentary is already ready. There's another story just as buried as this one. Another battle that historians call extraordinary and that the world outside Australia never fully understood. In a different theatre. With an outcome that also depended on what a small group of men decided to do when nobody else was watching. It's in the next video.